Photosynthesis. Today, we will be learning about what photosynthesis is and how it works. But before we dive in, let's break down the word. Photosynthesis has Greek roots. Photo is a prefix that comes from the Greek language meaning light. And the root word synthesis, also from the Greek, means to put together or to make. That brings us to the actual definition. Photosynthesis is the process in which green plants use sunlight to make their own food. But what's needed for photosynthesis to take place? Photosynthesis requires 4 things: light, chlorophyll, water, and carbon dioxide gas. Light can come from either the sun or artificially approved light. That light will then get absorbed by the plants using pigments called chlorophylls. Chlorophyll is the green that we see on plants. Like we just said before, those pigments absorb energy from the sun. Water comes from good soil when it rains, up through plants' roots. A fun fact is that plants only use about 5% of the water absorbed from their roots. The plant releases the rest of the water into the environment through tiny openings in the leaves. Lastly, carbon dioxide comes from the air that plants use in the photosynthesis process to feed themselves. The carbon dioxide enters the leaves of the plants through small pores called stomata. Once the carbon dioxide enters the plants, the process begins with the help of sunlight and water. Now that we know what's involved, where does photosynthesis happen on a plant? The photosynthesis process takes place in the leaves of plants. They are made up of tiny cells. Inside of these cells are tiny structures called chloroplasts. Each chloroplast has a green chemical called chlorophyll, which gives leaves their green color. Photosynthesis occurs in 2 stages. These stages are known as light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle. Step 1 is the light-dependent stage, or reaction. Chlorophyll and other pigments absorb energy from the sunlight. During these reactions, light energy is converted into ATP, which is a chemical energy, and NADPH, which is an electron carrier molecule. This energy is transferred to the photosystems responsible for photosynthesis. Water is used to provide electrons and hydrogen ions, but also produces oxygen. Do you remember what happens to the oxygen? Anyone? If yes, great. And if no, it's okay. Just remember that carbon dioxide contains oxygen, and that oxygen gets released back into the air through the stomata on the leaves. Since we know now that ATP is an energy storage molecule and NADPH is an electron carrier/donor molecule, we can explain how both ATP and NADPH will be used in the next stage of photosynthesis. The second stage is called the Calvin cycle, and it takes place in the stroma in the leaves. Although these reactions can take place without light, the process requires ATP and NADPH, which we have from the previous reactions from using light in the first stage. Carbon dioxide and energy from ATP along with NADPH are used to form glucose. The plants use some of the glucose, which is sugar, and store the rest. Just a reminder that the oxygen is released into the air for us to breathe. A fun fact is that the second phase is called the Calvin cycle because it was discovered by a scientist named Melvin Calvin. Let's go over some of these new words that we've been hearing before reviewing what we've learned so far. Photosynthesis is the process in which green plants use sunlight to make their own food. Chlorophyll is the green pigment in plants that absorb the energy from the sun. Carbon dioxide is a colorless, odorless gas that humans and animals breathe out. We release carbon dioxide into the air and the plants use it for the photosynthesis process. Stomata are the tiny holes or pores found on plants, leaves, and stems that control the exchange of water and gas for the plant. The light-dependent reaction is the first stage of photosynthesis where energy from sunlight is absorbed by chlorophyll and that energy is converted into stored chemical energy. ATP is an energy-carrying molecule that carries energy within cells. NADPH is an energy-carrying molecule produced in the first stage of photosynthesis, which then provides energy for the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is the second stage of photosynthesis that helps turn carbon dioxide into glucose. And glucose is a sugar that's used by plants for energy and to make other substances. Stroma is the liquid found inside the chloroplast and where the Calvin cycle takes place. Now, let's take a minute and review everything that we've learned so far. We've learned that photosynthesis requires four things: light, which comes from the sun; chlorophyll, which is the green that we see in plants; water, which plants take from soil through their roots; and carbon dioxide gas, where plants take in carbon dioxide from the air through stomata. We also know that the first stage of photosynthesis begins with the light-dependent reaction stage, where the chlorophyll absorbs light from the sun and converts it to energy. Water is used to provide electrons and hydrogen ions, but also produces oxygen for us to breathe. The second stage of photosynthesis is the Calvin cycle. It takes place in the stroma in the leaves, and it uses energy from the previous reactions to make glucose from carbon dioxide. The plants use some of the glucose as their food and store the rest. Phew! That was a lot of information, right? Well, let's take a breather. If you're confused, try rewatching the video or asking your teacher, parent, or guardian for any questions that you may have. Now that we've had a break, let's talk about some photosynthesis equations. Let's look at it from the point of view of an equation. So, like we know, photosynthesis is the process in which plants use the green on them to make their own food, using carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight to create glucose and release oxygen, which we use to breathe. The letters and numbers under each element are showing us the chemical formula of each element needed in the process. But don't stress if it looks wonky. You'll get to find out more when and if you take chemistry, but it's a fun fact to know. Photosynthesis is important because not only do plants make food and oxygen, but some of the glucose that plants have from the photosynthesis process are used, and that's why we are able to eat carrots, potatoes, apples, watermelons, and all the others. These foods provide energy for humans and animals. All of our energy for growth, development, and physical activity comes from eating food from plants and animals. Animals obtain energy from eating plants, and plants obtain energy from glucose made during photosynthesis. Our major sources of energy, such as natural gas, coal, and oil, were made millions of years ago from the remains of dead plants and animals, which we already know got their energy from photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is also responsible for balancing oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. Plants absorb carbon dioxide from the air and release oxygen during the process of photosynthesis. Great job, everyone! We made it through. That's a wrap. I hope you know enough to maybe teach someone else. Thanks for listening and happy learning.